Thank you. So the title of the talk is Dynamics of Social Inequalities in the Present World. I'm actually going to be talking more about economic inequalities, but I think those economic inequalities feed a great deal into social inequalities. And what's clear is that there are high levels of inequalities within most countries, and that they've been getting larger. They are much larger today than they were a third of a century ago. It is also clear that there is far from equal equality of opportunity. That means the life prospects of children of rich and well-educated parents are far better than those with poor and less well-educated parents. Indeed, in the United States, it appears that the prospects of a child from an underprivileged family that does well in school are poorer than that of a child from a well-off family that does not perform well in school. At one time, economists and other social scientists tried to justify these inequities through inequalities through the marginal productivity theory, which is what any of you would have studied if you studied economics. That says that individuals' incomes correspond to their marginal social contributions to society. Even a cursory look at the data shows that more of the individuals who have made that none of the individuals who have made the greatest contributions to our society, say through the inventions of the laser, the transistor, or the discovery of DNA, are among the richest. Among the richest are many who got their money from exploitation of market power or political connections. What I'm going to do, as the title reflects, is look at the dynamics of these economic and social inequalities. And the central thesis of this paper is to understand the dynamics of social inequality through, the argument is that looking at this through the competitive model, while it may provide a useful benchmark, it is departures from that benchmark that are really driving the changes in inequalities today. And I hope to give a little bit of a picture of what is going on. So when we look at what is going on in the distribution of income or wealth, we can look at what's happening at the top, and there more money or wealth is going to the top. We can look at the middle. There's a visceration at the middle, and a smaller fraction of the population are within, say, 1/2 to 1.5 times median income. And at the bottom, there's a larger fraction of the population are in poverty, and poverty has gotten more serious. What I'm going to do is first look at the data, because I think the data is striking and gives a picture a little bit of why what is going on and the dysfunctional nature of Americans' politics. And then I'll give some discussion of the interpretation of the data. So this is a picture, I'm looking at the US data because the US has the best data, but also the US is the worst case. So it is where the rest of the world is going if it imitates the American model. And those countries like the UK, who've done the best in imitating the American model, have outcomes that are the closest to the United States. And there are countries that have resisted that model where the outcomes are quite different. The implication of that, let me emphasize, is that the inequalities that I'm about to describe are not the result of just economic forces. They are the result of choices, of policies, and if countries take different choices, the outcomes would be different. And so it really shows that inequality, we might say, is a social construction. So this graph is really very telling. There is a line at the bottom that looks like a straight line. It's not the horizontal axis, it's the dark line. And that's what's been happening over the last 40-some years, 50 years, to the average income of the bottom 90%. And the fact that you don't see anything there says that the bottom 90% of America hasn't had any change in their income for 4 decades. The other extreme is something that you can see very clearly. The top 1% has been doing very well, and their incomes have been going up very markedly. This shows a similar picture for Europe. It's not quite as bad. The average income of the bottom 90% is also almost a straight line, and hard to distinguish from it. And a few of the European countries, as you can see, do not have the increase at the top anywhere near as extreme as the United States. And that just shows that it is a consequence of the policies that have been put in place. Again, this just looks at what's happened to the top 1%. In most of the countries in the advanced countries, there has been an increase in inequality. The curves there show the dotted line, the dotted square there shows where inequality was in the mid-'80s, and the blue line shows where it is today. And you see in most of the cases there's been a significant increase. There are a few countries like France where there's not been a significant increase, and obviously the Scandinavian countries have been the countries that have resisted an increase. The other point is you can see very dramatically there very high, large differences in the levels of inequality across countries, with the Scandinavian countries having much lower levels of inequality, and what we call Scandinavia, North America, Canada, also having a lower level of inequality. Now, this translates then, going back to the United States, translates into basically for those in the middle, there being stagnant incomes, so that income in the middle, median household income in the middle in the United States is basically the same as it was is below what it was 20 years ago. But more telling, these are average numbers, more telling looking at particular demographics, median income adjusted for inflation of a full-time male worker is lower than it was 40 years ago. And you can see that here. So that if you look at median income for, and these are the sort of the Trump voters in the Rust Belt. And if you look at that graph and you understand the kind of anger that they might have felt, they were told that each generation was going to have a higher income than the last, and now you have 2 generations of stagnation. Let me emphasize, this is the median income of a full-time male worker. Very large fractions of these workers can't get a full-time job. So if you did it of all people in that cohort, it would be much worse than this. So that it would have a marked decline relative to 40 years ago. At the bottom, things are worse. Again, the United States is this just shows the same thing from Europe where things are not quite as bad, but you see the stagnation in median income, and particularly the crisis countries have significant declines in median income. Italy is not a crisis country, but it's going to be, and its median income is already going down. At the bottom, real wages at the bottom are at the level that they were roughly 60 years ago. So what I want to emphasize here is we talk about the wonders of the market economy, and it should be clear that the market economy has not been working for the vast majority of our citizens. That the market economy, for all its virtues, has left out, sometimes we say there are a lot of people left behind. Well, 90% is a lot of people. That is to say, 90% have had stagnant incomes, and these are the people at the bottom, and their income is lower than it was 60 years ago. So it's very clear the market economy is not working in the way that it should be. Europe has done better. It's not like its real wages at the bottom are going up, but at least they are not going down in the way it has. This chart from Branko Milanovic, who's one of the great scholars in income inequality, just mentioned this very briefly. It's not my paper, but I think it brings out a number of things. And it illustrates what has been happening, the dynamics of inequality around the world. What he does is array everybody in the world, from the poorest and the richest, as if there were no boundaries, so no national boundaries, ranging from the poorest in the world to the richest. And what he does is look at their income in 1988 and says, what has been the growth of the income of those at the bottom, middle, and top over the last 20, 25 years. And there are two groups that have done very well. In percentage terms, the group that has done the best is that at the 50th, 60th percentile. That's the global middle class. That's the middle class in India and China. And they've had the highest percentage increase in their income. This group, the middle class, has been created. The second group that has done very well are the global billionaires, the global 0.1%. And while their percentage increase in income is not as much, you have to remember that their income is very high. So that a 1% increase in the income of a billionaire is a lot of money. And so, in fact, in terms of absolute dollars, the increase in income of that group is much larger than that of the global middle class. There are two groups that have not done very well. Those are the low-income people, the people at the bottom. They've not really participated in the growth of the global economy. And I'll comment later, that's partly because of the rules of globalization have deliberately disadvantaged them. But the other group that's not done very well is that group in the 80th, 90th percentile, and that's the middle class, the working class in Europe and America. So that's the angry young angry men, particularly, that you see in the United States and Europe, the Le Pen and the Trump supporters. Globally, wealth is more unequally distributed than income, and this just shows that 8 Americans from 2 families who made the right decision, the right choice. They chose their parents well, and so they didn't work for their money, inherited money. Those 8 people have as much wealth as the 44% of America. So that is testimony to both how much wealth there is at the top and how much little wealth there is at the bottom. Oxfam does a very forceful study every year at which they release in Davos, and when they first released it in 2014, the question was, how big of a bust do you need to have as much wealth as the wealth of the bottom 50% of the world? In other words, how big of a bust do you have to have as much wealth as the bottom 3.6 billion people? And initially, the bus had 85 seats. It's a pretty big bus. Well, the good news, if you want to put it that way, is we've gotten very efficient in inequality, and now we only need a minivan of 8 people, all men, and they have as much. These 8 people have as much wealth as 3.6 billion people. So these are really quite dramatic numbers. Not surprisingly, levels of inequality and increases of inequality of the kind that I've just described get translated into other aspects of well-being. And one particular aspect of well-being is health. Seeing yourself getting poorer and poorer is stressful, and that stress shows up in morbidity, mortality, life expectancy. So these are numbers that come from a study from Ann Case and Angus Deaton. Angus Deaton got the Nobel Prize in 2015. Very hard to see this very clearly, so let me just quickly go through the 4 panels of this. And it focuses on death rates among white males. The only reason it does that is because it wants to make clear this is not in the United States we have big racial divides, and people sometimes think what's going on is a question of differences across races, so it just looks at whites. And what it shows is the death rates among whites who have a high school education or less are rising, while those in fact, if you look at other groups like Hispanic Americans, they're declining, and what you see is that dramatic increase in the death rates. And this is true, the second column says that this is true if you look at every age cohort. There has been an increase in the death rate, which means the life expectancy is coming down. This is in contrast to what is going on elsewhere. And I think that's the best way of seeing how bad things are. You look at every one of those other countries and you see that, not surprisingly, smoking is going down, better health, people are more health conscious, and so you see the marked decline in mortality, except among U.S. whites, and this is for all U.S. whites in the age 45 to 54. The adverse effects are so great that in 2015, the life expectancy in the United States began to decline. And this is dramatic. These kinds of statistics, the only time I've seen numbers like this was when I was chief economist of the World Bank, and we saw what was happening in Russia. We first saw income data that showed that incomes were plummeting, but we weren't sure what was going on because income data is not reliable. or as reliable as demographic data. And when we started seeing the demographic data showing that marked decreases in life expectancy, we knew that society was not functioning. So these are really, you might say, a thermometer, a symptom of society falling apart. And obviously the election of Trump is a sign of society falling apart. In Russia, as in the United States, what was going on was not an increase in any particular disease like an AIDS epidemic or any other communicable disease. What is really going on is social diseases, and the last column shows that it's an increase in deaths, what they say, deaths of despair, suicide, drug overdose, alcoholism. And you can see that dramatic increase by U.S. whites, that red line going up, where in other countries it's either going down or remaining the same. So this gives you a picture of how bad things are in the United States. As I say, there's many other aspects of inequality, social inequalities. Access to the justice system is very unequal in the United States, is reflected in the mass incarceration data, which is disproportionately African American. But one other important aspect of inequality is equality of opportunity. And you might say Americans almost define themselves as being equal quality of opportunity, distinguishes itself from old Europe in thinking about inequality, inequality in terms of equality of opportunity, and something called the American dream. And what this chart shows is two things. First, to a very large extent, that notion of American dream is a myth. It's a social construction. It's something that Americans believe, but it isn't supported by the data. What that means is that, of course, people know examples of individuals who've done well, but social science is not based on examples. It's what are the average statistics? And the average statistics are not good. So this looks at, on the vertical axis, is a measure of mobility, intergenerational mobility, and on the horizontal axis is a measure of inequality of income, Gini coefficient. And what you see there is that more unequal societies have lower levels of equality of opportunity, and more equal societies have higher levels of equality of opportunity. So again, at the bottom, at the bottom left, you have the Scandinavian countries that have low levels of inequality, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and very high levels of intergenerational mobility. And at the other extreme, you have high inequality in the United States and United Kingdom, and very low levels of intergenerational mobility. So let me go on from here to try to say what is going on. What are the interpretations of this increase in inequality? Well, the basic idea, the basic model that I try to describe in words is that there are in our society, in terms of dynamics, forces, what I describe as centrifugal forces, forces pulling the society apart, and centripetal forces, forces pulling it together. And one can describe the equilibrium of the system at any time as a balance of the centrifugal and centripetal forces. And then one can analyze changes in the distribution of income and wealth as resulting from changes in this balance caused by changes in one of the forces, one of the centripetal or one of the centrifugal forces. So, for instance, the most important centripetal force bringing people together is good public education. And there's been a weakening of the quality of public education. In the United States, we have an education system, public education system, which is very local in nature. Control is very local. And one of the things that's happened over the last 40 years is that we have more economic segregation. That is to say, rich people live with rich people and poor people live with poor people. That means if you're born of rich parents, you live in a rich community that has good schools, and that means there's more intergenerational transmission of advantage. So that means that this centripetal force bringing society together has weakened, and that leads to greater inequality. Another example, one of the big centrifugal force is inheritance. And if you have less progressive taxation, that leads to more inequality. But America has gone even further. We have regressive tax systems where rich people pay a lower tax rate than people who are less rich. And in the proposal that Trump just put forward, he wants to make it more regressive. So he wants to create more inequalities in our society. So that's another example of a centrifugal force that is being strengthened. So you can go through and there are many of these forces, the extent of assorted, some of these are sociological, some related to economics, the degree of assorted mating. If there's more assorted mating, there's less of a centripetal force in the economy, and that will lead to more inequality. If there's greater dispersion in income, in market income, that will lead to a greater centrifugal force. If there's greater dispersion in family size, that will lead to a greater centrifugal force. So these are all examples of the forces that lead to greater inequality. Now, I want to one of the big changes in our understanding of what is driving the inequality in our society is today there's a realization that the competitive model, which was the benchmark model that everybody's taught in the basic economics course, provides a very bad description of what is going on in our economy. That a lot of the inequality is associated with the accumulation of rents. There's been an increase in rents. Some of those rents are associated with land rents, and some of those land rents are natural consequence of urbanization. Some of those are unnatural use of political power in using political power in the exercise of exceptions from zoning regulations, for instance. So that's one source. Intellectual property has given rise to a whole new set of rents that have become a very important source of inequality. But another important growth of rents has to do with the growth of market power, monopoly power. And if you look across industries, again looking more at the data of the United States, sector after sector is characterized by increasing concentration of industry. And there's an interesting discussion of why that is. It has to, some cases it's technology, in some cases it's just the enforcement of antitrust laws. Oh, okay. Is that saying I have to talk faster? Is that, okay. So let me talk faster then. The bottom line out of all of this is that it's not just rents. There's a broader, one of the things more broadly that's happened in our society is that the rules of the market economy have been rewritten beginning about over the last third of a century. Markets don't exist in a vacuum. They have to be structured, legal frameworks that talk about corporate governance, bargaining in labor markets, how labor markets function, antitrust, competition policy, bankruptcy law, every aspect of the legal structure, and how monetary policy is conducted, how globalization is structured, and all of these structure the economy. And the result of these is that they have been changed in ways to lead to greater inequality and actually lower economic growth, lead to, for instance, more short-termism in the market. That is to say, a more focus on consequences of the short term, next quarter, rather than long term. And that's resulted in slower economic growth and more inequality. The way of seeing the marked changes is this curve, which the dark blue line shows the increase in productivity, which goes on pretty steadily over the post-war period in the United States. But in the immediate period, 20 years or so after World War II, you see the pattern that exists before the war and across all countries, which is increases in productivity are followed in tandem by, or associated with increases in compensation. The two move very closely together. And suddenly, that broke. And so productivity continues, but compensation doesn't. So there wasn't any change in technology at that point that would have led to that marked break, but there were sudden changes in the legal frameworks and in policy frameworks that led to these changes. You cannot identify any, as I say, technology shock that could explain this, but there are policy frameworks that can change this. And you see exactly the same pattern going on in Europe, where productivity goes up, but compensation doesn't follow that same pattern. Let me just, so let me get, so this is the dramatic change that illustrates the force of how policies can lead to greater inequalities. The fact that compensation is fixed, relatively fixed, and productivity is going up is another way of saying the share profits are going up. And going up very, very dramatically. In fact, if you look at the share of labor, excluding the top 1%, where the top 1% tends to be people, include bankers and CEOs, so they're not labor in the usual sense. The share of labor in the United States has gone from about 80% down to 65% in a period of about a third of a century, which is a truly dramatic change. Okay, so let me now turn a little bit to the inequalities across countries. Here, there's been a convergence between the China, India, and the advanced countries, actually a very rapid convergence, but that kind of convergence that normal economic theory would have predicted has not occurred among the poorest countries, the countries of Africa and the advanced countries. And part of the reason is the rules of globalization. The rules of globalization actually helped India and China, but hurt Africa. And you see that in the agricultural subsidies. The advanced countries talked about free markets, talked about not subsidizing, but what they did is prevented the developing countries from subsidizing manufacturing so that they could catch up to the advanced countries, but they kept in place the agricultural subsidies, which lowered the agricultural prices that were, like cotton, that were received by sub-Saharan Africa, and that lowered their income. More broadly, for years, the Washington consensus policies, particularly the structural adjustment policies imposed on Africa and other poor countries by the World Bank and the IMF as a condition for their assistance, really impoverished these countries and denied them denied them a meaningful participation.
Could you manage to?
Okay, I'll just...
2 minutes.
So let me just say the remedies to this really follow from the diagnosis that I've given, so I won't say any more about that, and let me just say that what's happened in the last third of a century is really dramatic. It's unusual, and we should realize that how unusual it is, and that because it is so unusual, it is important for us to think about, and it has very important implications for the functioning of our societies, and therefore it behooves us to think about what to do to reverse this trend.